so they became pioneers. 5,000 years later, and their progeny formed 7 distinct races, and they must journey to an alien Earth, a magnificent visionary work of speculative fiction from a true visionary that will dazzle you with its depth, psychology, and awesome imagination. I read this book back in 2016, and it's still the main book I use to justify why I never DNF a book. Because at first this book was such tough going. I'm just not a science lover. I'm not into super detailed, super technical writing, especially of like space stations, the tech that they're using, like the different robots to go out on the surface of the space station, or about like astronauts and all this. It's just not something that really appeals to me, although I know it does to a lot of people. And that this book has a lot of that to start with, to the point where I just genuinely didn't know if I was going to be able to keep going through it, because I just couldn't get past the detail into the story behind it. And it is a behemoth as well. I think it's like 880 pages or something. It is a ginormous book, and when you start off a book that is that hard to get into, you really do question whether it's going to be worth it to continue that long. But then the description of the end of the world is so vivid, and it is so realistic that I still can picture it now, and at the time it gave me nightmares for like a week. And then beyond that, the world that starts being created, and there are some like jumps around a bit in history, it really grips you, and this kind of magic unfolds, and it's just a wonderful, really engaging story. And I can't believe that it's the same book that started how it started, and this is why I use it to justify why I don't ever give up on a book. It's because if I had listened to myself at the start, within the first 100 pages or whatever, then I would have missed out on this incredible book that I am still waiting for somebody to make a movie on, because it's so big I'm not going to read it again. But I genuinely loved it, and I very much recommend it if you haven't read it yet. Okay, book 2. You're going to have to hear me out on this one. It is called Dead Wake, The Last Crossing of the Lusitania. It's a non-fiction book, and I will read you the blurb, as I'll do for all of the books in this list. On the 1st of May 1915, a luxury ocean liner as richly appointed as an English country house sailed out of New York, bound for Liverpool. The passengers, including a record number of children and infants, were anxious. Germany had declared the seas around Britain to be a war zone. For months, its submarines had brought terror to the North Atlantic. But the Lusitania's captain, William Thomas Turner, had faith in the gentlemanly terms of warfare that had, for a century, kept civilian ships safe from attack. He also knew that his ship, the fastest then in service, could outrun any threat. But Germany was intent on changing the rules. Meanwhile, an ultra-secret British intelligence unit were tracking a German U-boat, but told nobody. Gripping and important, Dead Weight captures the sheer drama and emotional power of a disaster that helped place America on the road to war. So it sounds semi-interesting, right? But nothing spectacular. I didn't read the blurb and was like, yes. Also, not gonna lie, I don't know if I've just blocked it out of my memory, or if we weren't taught about it in school. I feel like we must have done, but maybe it was kind of just like a side note rather than a big feature. But yeah, either way, I don't remember anything about this story. is because it wasn't old information that I knew, that it was just being repeated back at me from a different voice. It was brand new information that I was learning about, and that kind of kept me going when it got a bit tough, like it was very much so at the start. And I genuinely am interested with most things to do with the war, because I don't know, I feel like I'm very lucky to be where I am, and live where I am and have the life I have. So to me, I can't really comprehend war, and I know it's different for a lot of people, and it's nobody should have to live with that in their daily lives. But it's very fascinating to me to read more about periods in history like this, and to see what happened and the kind of the triggers. So yeah, but it was very, very dry, very boring at first, because I guess it was a lot of scene setting. But then when it all kicked off, it was really almost read like a fiction book, because it was so powerful and so engaging. So another one I almost gave up on, but another one that I would genuinely recommend, especially if you're interested in that period of history. Number 3 is a slightly different take on this theme of a video. It is called The State of Affairs, Rethinking Infidelity. And so rather than this one being that I struggled to read at first and then it became amazing, this is one that I just did not want to read whatsoever, and actively avoided it for a while. So it was a book list book, as you can tell, so I had to read it to tick everything off, but I kept putting it off and moving it to the bottom of the list. And this is why, so I'll read you the blurb. Infidelity is the ultimate betrayal, but does it have to be? Relationship therapist Esther Perel explains why people cheat and unpacks why affairs are so traumatic, because they threaten our emotional security. In infidelity, she sees something unexpected, an expression of longing and loss. A must-read for anyone who has ever cheated or been cheated on, or who simply wants a new framework for understanding relationships. So, from that blurb, I got it into my head that this book was almost going to justify people who cheat on their partners, and I guess let them off the hook, because it's, you can reframe it in something else. And so I actively avoided it because I thought it was just going to make me ridiculously mad. And she does go into detail and give stories about couples who have been through infidelity and come out the other side, and obviously that is a choice that is very personal to the couple, and I guess the situation, the circumstances of what happened. I personally, even after reading this book, it is not something that I would ever consider, and maybe that says more about my emotional insecurity. But as somebody who has been cheated on in a past relationship, it's just, I don't know, there were some parts in the book that made me want to give up, purely because it was just an opinion that I feel very strongly about. But again, I think that says more about me than anything else. But on the other side, and why it turned it around for me, is that it does genuinely, Esther does genuinely share some interesting insights into her work, and especially around the idea of emotional security. And I found that part really interesting, and hearing the anecdotes. And she also talks about a lot of different types of relationships that she touches on, you know, open relationships, or the idea of monogamy in itself, and there's heterosexual, homosexual relationships, and it's just thought it was going to be a justification for people to go off and cheat because it's society's fault, not theirs. It's not that at all. It actually is more enlightening than infuriating. So it's not for everybody, don't get me wrong, but it is a book that I am actually glad I didn't give up and put in the bin. Book 4 is back in the realm of fiction, and it is called The Windfall. And all I remember when I first started reading this book is that the main character, Mr. Jar, J-H-A, annoyed me so much that I genuinely thought, I actually can't do this. And actually I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me read you the blurb first. For the past 30 years, Mr. and Mrs. Jar's lives have been defined by cramped spaces, cut corners, gossipy neighbours, and the small dramas of stolen yoga pants and stale marriages. They thought they'd settled comfortably into their golden years, pleased with their son's acceptance into an American business school. But then Mr. Jar comes into an enormous and unexpected sum of money and moves his wife from their housing complex in East Delhi to the super rich side of town, where he becomes eager to fit in as a man of status, skinny ties, hired guards, shoe polishing machines, and all. The move sets off a chain of events that rock their neighbours, their marriage, and their son, who is struggling to keep a lid on his romantic dilemmas and slipping grades, and brings unintended consequences, ultimately forcing the family to reckon with what really matters. And it wasn't just Mr. Jar, going back to my first point, it wasn't just Mr. Jar who annoys me. The book is told from a few different perspectives, and one of those is their son, who's studying in America, as the blurb mentions. He also very much annoyed me. I think that combined just made it almost excruciating, and maybe it was because of the superficial nature of the characters, or maybe, I guess, a lack of depth to start with before the background had been filled in, I guess, more, but it really wound me up. And I don't know if it was just that I got used to the characters, or that because there are other perspectives as well, it balanced it out. But it did turn it around for me, and a big part of that is there are some genuinely funny parts in this book that make you laugh out loud. It's set in, I think it said, set in Delhi, and I think there's what I would describe as light social satire as well. I find it really interesting to read about different cultures, even if it is from a semi-satirical standpoint, but anything that gives you a glimpse into another culture I find really fascinating. And so I think like all of those factors together helped turn it around for me, and I actually found myself being quite invested in how the family kind of come together and pull through. And I actually ended up giving the book an 8 out of 10 by the time I'd finished. So, I mean, if that doesn't say I'm glad I hung in there, I don't know what does. Okay, book 5, the final book I'm going to talk about today, might catch me a bit of heat from the diehards, but it is Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, so the screenplay of the theatre production. So I'm just going to say it, I'm going to admit it, I'm going to treat this like a confession. I am not a Potterhead, or whatever the fans are called. Up until last year, I hadn't seen all of the movies, and I still have only read the first 3 books, so I can't say I'm a big fan of the Wizarding World. It's just not a series for me, and if you've watched a few of my videos, you'll know that I'm not really into fantasy that much. I'm slowly coming around, but it's not the genre that I'm drawn to the most. We actually had friends come over from India last year for our wedding, and a couple of days after, they had said that it was their dream to go to Harry Potter World in Watford, I think it is. So we went with them, and I mean, it was very interesting to learn about how the movies are made and to see the real sets, but I had no idea what was going on most of the time. I think you can imagine that when this book popped up on a book list, I was less than thrilled, especially because when you first start reading it, it's very apparent that you should know and understand what has happened in the Harry Potter world. You need that knowledge, and I don't have that knowledge, and so I thought it was going to be a very tedious read of me just being completely in the dark about most of what was happening, and I really wanted to stop reading it because of that. Maybe it's because it's a screenplay of the theatre show, so it has a lot of stage directions, and it's written really punchily. Obviously there's not a lot of description of the scene, and I guess because of that it really puts you in the moment, and it makes you very immersed in it. And I thought it would do the opposite. I thought I would need the description to help me, but actually being able to picture it like a stage, it immersed me a lot quicker, and I found it very gripping, I have to say. And I actually read it in one sitting on the train, and I went from thinking, God, I do not want to read this, I want to give up, to, oh my God, I have to finish this book before the train gets into the station because I need to know what happens. So it was a complete 360, and I'm very glad I read it, and I would go so far as to say that I would watch it in the theatre. Maybe I haven't managed to convince you to stray from your DNF process, and that is absolutely fine. Reading books, everybody's reading process is different, everybody approaches it in a different way, and that is completely up to you. I just wanted to share my view on DNFing. As I said right at the start, I know that there are a lot of books that I definitely should have just sacked off immediately, but there's just something in my brain that doesn't let me give up. And I'm okay with that. I've made my peace with that. And who knows, hopefully there'll be many more books in the future, like the ones I mentioned today, that I'm glad I stuck in there for. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear about any books that you started off despising but ended up loving. So let me know in the comments.